Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
We are on page 2 of our pamphlet, our booklet, with the selections from Jews and Their Lives by the beloved Martin Luther. And we are on the second paragraph halfway down. So just by way of a quick review, from Martin Luther, we have learned that the Jews are the children of the devil and a brood of vipers, and that we our synagogues are dens of devils, and that we make our living by the accursed usury. And now we are discovering that the Jews are a bunch of liars. Isn't that exciting? Yeah.
Other than that, are we okay?
What?
I would say, other than all that, are we okay?
No, there's more. You ain't seen nothing yet. All right. So we are on the paragraph about being liars, and we are in the middle. Let me see. In that paragraph, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines down, the first word is years, and then there is a ellipsis, and then there it begins with the word Christ. So who wants to start with that point, please?
Christ and his word can hardly be recognized because of the great vermin of human ordinances.
Right, so let's stop right there. So,
however, let this suffice.
Wait, hold on. What he's talking here about the 2,000 years of the Jews saying things about the presence of Jews, right? Not, it couldn't be 2,000 years with Christ because we're all 1,500, but it goes back to the Bible. In other words, what he's saying here is that the Jewish interpretation of Scripture is such that it is you can't recognize Christ and his words, which is an interpretation of Jewish Scripture, because of the vermin of human ordinance, which we would call halakha. Remember, Judaism is the religion of law.
Law versus love.
Versus love, which is Christianity. Right. So that's what this is saying. Okay, so but that's our fault because we have all this garbage that our sages have produced over the centuries and so forth. We cannot appreciate what Jesus has said, and that just is another factor that leads into our propensity toward lying. Okay, but then he's got a great concept here right away. Go ahead.
However, let this suffice for the time being on their lies against doctrine or faith. Alas, it cannot be anything but the terrible wrath of God which permits anyone to sink into such abysmal, devilish, hellish, insane baseness, envy, and arrogance.
All right, so who really is responsible for for the depth of our propensity as liars? God, because it's punishment. Okay, it's punishment for us for what we are, which is liars. So basically says, you want to be liars? Fine, am I going to make you liars? Nowhere the world has never seen such things like liars like you. Okay, it's sort of the sense of the way God treated Pharaoh with the 10 plagues. Okay, in the first part of the 10 plagues, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. In the second part is where God steps in. Okay, and the Midrash in picking up on this, which is accurate, by the way, if you read very closely, you will see that in plagues 1 through 5 and plague 7, it doesn't say God hardened Pharaoh's heart. It either says he did it or it hardened. God only comes into play in 4 of the 10 plagues. And the whole point was, and the rabbis pick up on this, and I think it's probably correct, Martin Luther notwithstanding. And the point was, Pharaoh, I've given you 6 opportunities to let my people go, and in each time you chose not to do that. Okay, therefore, I'm locking you in on that choice. It is going to become a much more profound expression of who you are, and you're going to suffer because of that. Okay? And it's a very, Maimonides' little philosophy here doesn't deal with that particular point, but he's of the opinion that actually actions how you run your life shapes your character. And if you choose to run your life on the basis of immorality and lying, etc., over time, that is going to take over your character and you won't be able to get out of it. And there's that truth in that. We now know that, in fact, activity can shape a person's character. If you do something over and over, meaning, doing, and there's the same thing in the other direction. If you become accustomed to being ethical, moral, and compassionate and all the good stuff, you'll probably end up being more like that. That's basically what Rambam says. So is this notion that, of course, obviously, Luther is going to ascribe that to God as part of his punishment of us. And so we're stuck. And that's why the Christians got to stay away from us. Okay? All right. And then, Margaret, continue. If I were to, go ahead.
If I were to avenge myself on the devil himself, I should be unable to wish him such evil and misfortune as God's wrath inflicts on the Jews, compelling them to blaspheme so monstrously in violation of their own conscience.
Right.
Anyway, they have their reward for constantly giving God the lie.
Right. And that's their reward, giving God the lie reward, said sarcastic. Okay, thank you. Very good. So now he has another thought. That is another solution to the Jewish problem. Okay, thank you, Margaret. Somebody else read bottom paragraph. Eject them. I cut out some earlier words which were sort of a non sequitur, so I just began over there. By the way, there are typos here, and I realized after I sent this out to you that there are typos. The typos are not mine. I know mea culpa. That's what came off of the material that I took out of the Jewish Virtual Library's version of this. Okay, so somebody there who transferred this in have these typos. And I will obviously, if you haven't noticed them, clarify them to you as we go along. Okay, Bert.
Yeah, eject them forever from this country. For as we have heard, God's anger with them is so intense that gentle mercy will only tend to make them worse and worse, while sharp mercy will reform them but little.
All right, so what is sharp mercy? Sharp mercy, imagine the classic line as the parent is got his or her strap and they're whooping their kid, and what do they say? This hurts.
It's going to hurt me more than it hurts you.
Right. Okay, that's sharp mercy, right? And sometimes you've got to do something strong to sort of shake your kid up and say, okay, I got you. All right. So basically, that's what he's saying. But so sharp mercy might help, then he says, but it will reform them but little. He's going to get back to that later on. If you read the whole thing through, he talks about converting Jews. Okay, and that's, you'll see what he says, something similar to this. Okay, therefore,
in any case, away with them.
Away with them.
Is he talking about expulsion?
Yes, yeah, right. And again, it's interesting that he should say this because he's writing this sometime around in 536, 538, somewhere there. By that time, if you expel the Jews from Germany, you're going to be hard pressed to find Jews because most of the communities have already kicked them out. So in a sense, he's talking to the wind here. Okay, there were communities where there still were Jews, and they were being expelled as we moved through the 16th century. But the vast majority of them were already in Poland.
The lack of Jews has never prevented anti-Semitism.
Right. In fact, in some instances, it grows worse because you don't have the real ones there to see that they are somewhat human. Right, and a lot of the anti-Semitic, some of those pictures I showed you, with the devil with the Jew badge on him, right? That whole approach, that whole phenomenon, where Jews weren't around, or the wandering Jew, the image of the Jew with the huge sack of used clothing over his shoulder, 16th, 17th century European, in different places. Okay. That was one Jew is seen moving through the land. He doesn't live there. He's moving along. And that's symbolic. It's sort of the punishment of Cain. Navanati abaretz. You will be a wanderer throughout the land. And the curse of Cain is applied to this in Christian circles. Okay. All right, moving on.
Okay. Over and above that, we let them get rich on our sweat and blood, while we remain poor, and they suck the marrow from our
suck
the marrow from our bones, right?
So that's what we do, right? They work and we suck the marrow from their bones. We get rich on their, the interest we pay them on their loan. And then in brief, now here's the conclusion. The word, it's not I, it's in.
In brief, dear princes and lords, those of you who have Jews under your rule, if my counsel does not please you, find better advice, so that you and we all can be rid of the unbearable devilish burden of the Jews, lest we become guilty sharers before God in the lies, blasphemy, the defamation, and the curses which the mad Jews indulge in so freely and wantonly against the person of our Lord Jesus Christ, this dear mother, all creatures, all authority, and ourselves.
All right, we're going to be, if we keep around too long, we're going to start to emulate them.
This is really, he's mad.
Yes.
He's
really mad. Yeah.
I go back.
I think by mad you mean insane.
I mean both. Yeah, he had a bad time with those rabbis when he met with the rabbis, and they wouldn't. That we talked about last week.
Right, exactly. It really, made him really angry.
Yeah, this is not. I'm not going to say sane. This is not rational argument.
No. I mean, it isn't. But in his mind, when his mind flipped, everything fell into place. So he really believed that, and he had contact with people who taught him about Judaism in a number of ways, going back a few decades. Johannes Reuchlin, who knew Talmud and Kabbalah, he learned with him early on, and he learned some basic ideas that he came to appreciate. He learned about the Jewish elements of Jewish commentary on the Torah from an Italian monk, 14th century, called Nicholas de Lyra. And Nicholas de Lyra translated the Bible and Rashi's commentary. So actually, and Luther based his understanding of the Hebrew Bible on the translation into Latin of Nicholas de Lyra. But he also had Rashi's commentary. And while he wasn't an expert on Rashi, he was familiar with Rashi's commentary. So, I mean, he had a kind of a background, and it was his firm belief that within that framework, rational, intelligent, learned Jews would come to understand his understanding of the Bible. And so, that's the baggage that he brought into that meeting with those three rabbis. Okay, and then boom. And again, these were presumably the greatest minds, so he thought, in the community. And if they can't get it, how much more so the rest of these stupid? And he considers us stupid, and everything else flows from. Okay, we are now in the top paragraph of page 3. So somebody's going to give me the answer. I'm going to ask the question. These last 3 lines, what indulge freely and wantonly against the person of our Lord Jesus Christ, his dear mother, all Christians, all authority, and ourselves. Okay, that's what we have. So where does he learn about our defamation and blasphemy and lies regarding Jesus Christ and his dear mother? Where could he get that from?
That's how he interprets the Torah.
No, but there's a source that's not in the Torah that we had talked about. I'm giving you a little quiz.
So the Talmud has a number of references, and some of them are with regard to his mother potentially being a prostitute,
right,
et cetera.
Et cetera. That is correct. Except the reality is, with rare exceptions, by the 16th century, texts of the Talmud that are floating around probably didn't have those because
It's the Toldot Yeshua.
Yeah, that's it. Yes.
Or whatever. Yeah.
Would like to focus. I mean, no, AJ, it's not absolute. It's possible that there were certain manuscripts around that somehow the censorship of the Talmud missed, and it could be that they were there. So I'm not going to exclude that, conclusively. But I would suggest the Toldot Yeshu thing we know in the 16th century were floating around, and that there were certain circles of church people, monks, who had begun to collect them in Hebrew. Okay, so the knowledge of this, whether it came, and there were, by the way, in Germany, we know about this going back, no, it was in France, in France, there were actual compilations of sources of this kind from the disputations that took place over the course of the 13th century, okay, in Paris, okay, and then again in Spain, in Barcelona. So those texts resulted in the censorship, but they were compiled soon after these disputations, and there were these collections floating around Christian monasteries, because the monks were the ones who were reading these. And then, of course, you have a small but nonetheless of angry group of Jews who converted to Christianity and kept that pot boiling. So there were a number of avenues through which this notion of demeaning Jesus and Mary, right, because all of these compilations had those statements.
Is another possible avenue, because you're talking about the 1500s.
No, 1500s.
You said 16th century and therefore 1500s, but during the 1456 collapse of Constantinople, just prior to that period, there was there were people trying to get out of Constantinople, going westward, largely Christians, carrying texts. They were not obviously yet printed works. Is it possible that some of that material also had, because they were in contact or closer contact with the East, that they would have had also perhaps additional sources?
I don't know. I have no idea on the degree to which these documents were collected by monks in the church. I don't know. I can't answer the question.
Well, it wouldn't necessarily have been monks. It could have also been philosophers. Constantinople had a wide variety.
I have not read anything that brings those people to the front.
Okay.
The closest I could think about would be Italy, right? Because Italy was sort of, on the borderline geographically, and there could have been some spillage in that place, because these kinds of issues were being percolated in Italy. There's no question. The Talmud in Italy was burned in 1553, and that it was preceded by a number of evaluations of it back and forth during the earlier part of that century. Okay, so it may be, it's possible that that there had been volumes of the Talmud that were not censored floating around in the areas of the Eastern Church. It is possible, but I don't know enough about it to be able to answer. It's a good question.
So the Venetian trade route then, interesting. Thank you.
The fact is that in many ways, for all of the difficulties, the Catholic tradition was more stable until the latter part of the Middle Ages, when the monks really took it over in many ways. But the Jews in Catholic areas sort of knew what the rules were, whereas the Jews in the Byzantine areas, they didn't have this kind of papal authority that set standards that could be imposed upon the bishops if the popes chose to do so. Okay, and if the bishops chose to listen to them. But it was relatively speaking, the Jews knew what the situation was. In the Byzantine areas, there was no such central authority to the degree that there was in the Catholic areas. And so you have you look at the history of the Jews in those areas, up and down and up and down and up and down. very unstable. I mean, that's why the Jews in those areas, when the Ottomans took over in the 50s, when the as you were saying, when a lot of Christians left and the Ottomans took over, it was heaven. It was absolute heaven, and for centuries the Jews in the Ottoman Empire were relatively okay. Okay, yeah, so that's as we say in Hebrew, zesus mitzeva acher, which means that's a horse of a different color. Now you learn some Hebrew. Let's go on. All right. So Bert, finish that paragraph. Do not grant them. Listen to this one. Go ahead.
Do not grant them protection, safe contact, or communion with us. With its faithful counsel and warning, I wish to cleanse and exonerate my conscience.
Yes. I feel so much better now that I let this all. Yes. All right.
This could be like today the most virulent white nationalist anti-Semitism.
Yes. Well, there is.
Stuff is like completely over the top.
No, there is Christian nationalist white anti-Semitism.
No, for sure.
Yeah.
I know not a lot of Lutherans, and they don't believe.
No, Lutheranism has changed on this point considerably. We're going to get back to some modern expressions of that in the last few pages of what I sent you. We'll talk about that at the end. Okay. All right. Yes. Okay. Next, please. Let the government deal with them. Go ahead. Someone else. You raised your hand. Okay, good.
Let the government deal with them in this respect, as I have suggested. But whether the government acts or not, let everyone at least be guided by his own conscience and form for himself a definition or image of a Jew. However, we must avoid confirming them in their wanton lying, slandering, cursing, and defaming. Nor dare we make ourselves partners in their devilish ranting and raving by shielding and protecting them, by giving them food, drink, and shelter, or by other neighborly, acts, probably.
Yeah. All right. So there he's trying to sort of back off a little and say, be human being, right? Notice, define for yourself how you're going to handle this. Just make sure that you don't do anything that in any way reinforces the Jews in the evil path that they have chosen for themselves. All right. And again, don't give them food, drink, and shelter. So, it's really getting very nasty.
Well, this is interesting about guided by his own conscience, because isn't that sort of the point of the Protestant Reformation, is that we don't just go to the authority of the church anymore. We have our own
that's part of
right or whatever.
In a sense, Protestantism, allows for that.
Right. Except don't really go there if it's Jews.
Well, you have to. The government is one thing, right? But he's now talking about your own private dealings with them, okay? And, he understands that the government has to balance all kinds of, he's no naive guy. But we as individuals, he's saying, yes, take this to heart, find your path, as long as it basically conforms to the outline that I have laid before you. That's why he wrote the book, right? And had it published. And again, the fact that at this time, printing exists, right? So it can actually be published, not just remain in a script form. Okay, very good. Someone else now. What shall we Christians do? So now he's going to lay out his plan of 8 steps. Okay, there's a little redundancy here, but now you can see he's trying to really create an organized approach that people, the government, as well as the individual, can follow in order to deal with the Jews. Okay, and basically he's hoping that he's speaking as a professor, as a churchman, a scholar, as a believer, etc., that he can have an impact not only on the masses, but also on the government. So obviously the concept of no separation of church and state is not apple. But look, during the Middle Ages, it wasn't anyone. We know this. So that's nothing new. Okay. Who was reading? Oh, somebody. Yeah, that's right. All right.
I'll read.
Okay, Barbara, what shall we
Christians do with this rejected and condemned people, the Jews? Since they live among us, we dare not tolerate their conduct, now that we are aware of their lying and reviling and blaspheming. If we do, we become sharers in their lies, cursing, and blasphemy. Thus we cannot extinguish the unquenchable fire of divine wrath of which the prophets speak, nor can we convert the Jews.
Okay, so remember, looking now at the Bible, he speaks of the prophets, right? And if you are a student of the Bible, those of us take my Amos class, you know what I'm talking about here when the prophets gets really angry and talks about fire and brimstone, so to speak, coming, hitting the land and hitting the people, particularly the wealthy, because of how they are living, right? So, and Luther knows this well. He knows it, not only from reading de Lira's text translated, but also he knows from Rashi, right? Rashi's commenting on the prophets as well as the Torah, as we all know. And so he picks up, inklings of that, and he's basically saying that this is the way they are, right? And this is the fire of divine wrath that we cannot stop, nor can we convert the Jews. That's a general statement. Nor can we convert the Jews. Okay, now jumping ahead for a moment, because we'll come back to that. If you are a Nazi-leaning Lutheran in Germany in the 1930s, and you read that line, we cannot convert the Jews, think about how that fits in, ultimately, where Hitler was going with his ideology. Now, he didn't get it from Luther. Truth is, he came from a Catholic family. But clearly, he was influenced by the racial ideology that were popping up that began to appear in the 19th century. We'll study them in a few weeks, okay? But the point is, it's interesting that here, the biblical-based image of the and the secular racial image of the Jew converge. And now you can understand why believing Luther, having read this, and we will see how this was distributed soon, are going to say, my God, Hitler is saying the same thing we believe in. So we got to support this guy. And as we've mentioned in that election in 1933, the support for Hitler in the Lutheran areas was like twice as strong as it was in the non. So the message will be percolating as we move through the coming century. Okay, continuing.
Before I continue reading, do you think that the Lutherans are this bad now? I know when I was in medical school.
No.
Okay, because in medical school, one of my classmates, who was also a classmate in junior high, was a Lutheran.
Yeah.
And she invited me to go to a thing like going to Ramah for the weekend with a whole bunch of Christians and me.
Yeah.
And they didn't in any way attempt to change me. They were more interested in my ideas as a Jew to how they were different from them. But I didn't find any bit of anti-Semitism at that point.
No, that's true. That's right. It shifted completely.
Oh, it has. Okay. Thank you.
And when we would have these meetings, these study sessions with the Lutherans were often the most liberal.
Really?
The Protestants, yes, in terms of reaching out to Jews, understanding, want to learn about Judaism, appreciating Judaism, and so forth and so on. Remember, we used to, when we were with them, whether it was at Ramah in Ojai or in a monastery up in Northern California, and this happened. We rotated every other year. We were, in these places. At the end of the meals, that we would break bread. A Christian would break bread, and at the end of the meals, we said Birkat Hamazon. There's the abbreviated Ramah version of Birkat Hamazon. Well, no, it wasn't Ramah. It was United Synagogue. It was quite an abbreviated, but it had all the basic points.
We have one in the United Synagogue.
Yeah, right. It's not the one they use now. It's an older one. They put some more stuff in. Anyway, back in. Anyhow, but it was technically a kosher abbreviated Birkat Hamazon. And, they sung along with us. They had the transliteration, so they could go along with us. And they loved it. They resonated with it completely. The warmth between these groups was just amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Margaret.
I just want to, one of the things that occurred to me when Bert was talking about, just the vitriol coming from Martin Luther here is that, this was during a time in history when people actually were believing in witches. Like there were attributions of supernatural evil being, given to other human beings. Yes. So within the last 500 years, things have obviously changed dramatically. And I think, and so that would be reflected, right,
absolutely
in all the changes in all the Protestant sects. Yeah.
I mean, I see your hand, Tybal. I mean, all the stuff with the devil and the Jews, right? It was part of in which began, you could see it in writings, going, well, I mean, it was in Luke, John chapter 8 has it right there. But the point is that all of these tendencies that began to emerge during the latter Middle Ages, going into the early modern period, definitely there are a lot of mystical things. I mean, the rise of Kabbalah, it's not the same thing, but basically the Kabbalah requires a great leap of faith, so to speak, to plunge into that system, which at first blush sounds quasi-pagan. Okay, you talk about the Zohar, you talk about the Sefirot. I'm not going to go into details here, but I mean that problematic. It could be, but the need for these for different reasons, no question. And again, you can say that the rise in the 18th century of the Industrial Revolution, and on the one hand, that whole change into modernism reinforced the liberal trend that had developed in Judaism as well as Christianity. But on the other hand, people who were on the more to the fringes or the more extreme expressions of all of it were scared out of their wits by these years. It was a revolution in society, and secularism began to grow. And I can tell you, within the Jewish communities, you suddenly have strong pushbacks by the Orthodox, even when you have the development in Germany of a more liberal Jewish tradition within Orthodox. But at the same time, you've got rabbis, in Eastern Europe, when they're hearing about this, they're going crazy. So the extremism on both sides begins to emerge. Well, that in a certain sense, we're going through that right now. And it's a real challenging thing. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Tybal and then AJ.
For me, it's not the vitriol that's surprising. We have different life experiences where we grew up, but I'm just struck by the unquestioning certainty that he's speaking for God and that he really knows. And I think sometimes in any religious system, let's say more right-wing Judaism leaders, the right rabbis of those branches feel that they're speaking for God, but the certainty, that's what seems to me the most extreme. And unfortunately, as opposed to, as Margaret was saying, about things that have changed in however many hundreds of years, that sense of certainty. I'm sputtering a little because I just think at least the movements of Judaism are thought that speak to me. No one is just that certain.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good point. And I think he personally, because of the fact that he was an in-depth scholar, right? I mean, he was known to be a scholar, and I'm sure he considered himself a deep scholar. So the certainty came out of the fact that he really believed that he had uncovered, a real deep truth. I mean, I can tell you today, I know people who are scholars, brilliant scholars, and they hold opinions that have become marginal because certain of their interpretations of different things have been shown to be not necessarily accurate. But in their minds, they believe that they are right. And you could hit them over the head with a Talmud, and shake up the brain. It still wouldn't change them. And it's because they know that they have been viewed as great scholars. And so everybody said, you're a great scholar. How can you still hold on to this? So the guy says, yes, I am a great scholar. I know, look at all the things I know. You forgot to look at how this relates to that and that relates to that. Oh, what do you guys know? I mean, it's nothing new. But yes, yeah, I think that, I think that you're right. Yeah, okay, AJ.
This is really a question following Barbara's comment, and it has to do with modern day or more recent evolutions of Lutheranism and Protestantism. So in Germany, there is an Evangelische Kirche, which is a Verein, a union of Lutheran churches, Reformed churches, in other words, Protestant non-Catholic churches. It's not the only non-Catholic group, but in the United States, when we speak of evangelicals, we're talking about a very separate group from the Lutherans and others. Could you comment on the relationship? And when Barbara described her experience going to a Lutheran camp, if you could comment on that, maybe not in this lecture, but as far as what the modern day groups, what their positions are in reality, more in reality or in practice than in theory. That's one thing. And also, I don't know whether your material covered this, but my recollection is that Luther started out thinking that the Jews would convert once they saw that he was beating up the church.
We began by talking about that. Yeah.
Okay. And I apologize for not being able to dial in sooner.
That's okay. I don't, no problem. That's why I cut you off. Yes, we did for sure. Yes, absolutely.
So not so surprising that he would change his tune, but the degree to which he became murderous is disturbing.
Well, I made the observation that when we come to Islam, it's the same thing happened with Muhammad.
Yeah,
not identical, but very similar.
Well, these guys they are ambitious.
Yeah, but they do come to it from different perspectives. But the point is, this notion of having built up in your mind a concept that is so seminal as to how you view issues around you, and then you find out that all of this mental or spiritual energy that you put into it is totally rejected by the object of all that spiritual energy. It's a slap. It's a punch in the belly, a big one. And that's to some degree, that's what happens in human nature. If you have the faith, this notion, the certitude, right, that you guys were talking about, that's part of the problem.
Do you concur with Professor Rubin?
AJ, wait a minute.
Okay, sure. Sorry.
Jackie.
I know, Rabbi, did any of these people, like Luther and all the others you've taught us, the spokespeople for anti-Semitism, ever try to square their religion being the religion of love and Jesus being a loving God with all the hate they expressed against Jews? Did anybody ever say, well, I know we're the love people, but we got to hate them? That's what I've never been able to put together, how they justified all their hatred for Jews with being the religion of love. Or is the religion of love thing more recent? I don't know.
No, I mean, their concept, no, I think that was part of what Margaret was talking about, that these more open-minded community really took it very seriously. And I've never really looked into this on a timetable, but I think a number of them probably were influenced by the results of the Shoah. Because, they realized that even though the Nazi movement was not a religiously founded movement, especially when you start reading what came out, even more recently about the voting that I was talking about, when new documents came out, when the Russians opened up their archives and allowed scholars to get into there and see what the Nazis had been writing and had been doing, and you can see how these were all you have these links with the existing dominant religion in Germany. Okay, that really gave them food for second thoughts about all this, and hence the reactions to that as extreme as that was then, you could say they became extremely liberal in respect to the Jews. So it may have been a way of, cleansing them of their guilt. I have to believe that was, I never asked this. It's something I'd love to talk about, actually, with some of these clergy people. Maybe if I get
up until then, all the years, Paul and all the other names you've taught us all along, how did they put the idea of Christianity and love?
Yeah, there's a lot. Yes, there is. There's no question that the concept of the love of the Jew disappears for centuries within Christianity. Absolutely. It's tolerance. And it's tolerance because it was the will of God. And if God hadn't said so, they could have done a Holocaust centuries before. And the irony is that the ambivalence that both Islam and Christianity had towards Judaism complicated things for the Jew, because the toleration that existed, which was basically much more pragmatic than it was ideological, because for centuries Jews were actively participating in doing things that from which the general society benefited. And that is a historical fact. Again, we didn't control things, but we were doing things, whether it was being in the Islamic countries, sewing clothes, being leather worker, being metal worker, things like everybody else, right? But being like that with the relative tolerance that in many centuries of interaction with Muslims, the Jews' place in the society, they were normal people, But when extremism set in, and the extremism often followed certain kinds of social or economic crises and chaos, then suddenly these people who had been seen as present, accepted, quiet, responsible, right, become targets of the other element within the other side of the spectrum, right? The spectrum shifts from the more tolerant to the less tolerant side. And suddenly, because we are strangers, we are aliens, we are different, we don't accept that which which the Muslims or the Christians believe to have been the absolute, unquestionable truth, and we don't do that, something's wrong with us. We never realized it before, but something is wrong with us, and therefore we became anathema. Then switches back when suddenly guilt sets in. That hasn't happened as much in the Islamic world, to be sure. But the fact is, in the Christian world, that's set in. And to this day, we still have many instances. Now, to be very blunt and honest on this, there is no question that there are elements in the left side of the liberal Christian community that find Israel to be a really, really, strong issue, to the point where they slip into what we might call anti-Semitic perspective. Being critical of Israel in and of itself, I'm making a political statement. Being critical of Israel is not anti-Semitism. Being critical of Israel and saying, therefore, it should not exist, that is anti-Semitism. All right? You can be critical of a government. I'm critical of all kinds of governments. You are critical of governments. Israel itself, there's no reason why criticism of a government is to be seen as hating the people whom the government represents, right? And so, but that has, unfortunately, that's something, we'll talk about that toward the end of the class, but that is something, that's a manifestation that becomes very troubling. And those kinds of extreme perspectives pop up, usually toward the fringes of the extremes, where a new reality is perceived that fits in with one could argue, some of the seemingly legitimate and viable perspectives, but unfortunately it just pushes them to their extreme, where white becomes black. I'm not making a racial statement here, just in terms of the color spectrum. And that happened. Very complicated. Okay, Tybal, we must read on, so please, I hope it's brief.
Just brief, that I think, though, some of the change is not just the horrors of what was known about the Shoah, but the change in what people thought in the surrounding culture about eternal souls and belief going from a world, best example, where really poor people gave money to build cathedrals rather than eating because it was going to do something for their eternal soul, or even Jewishly, where Jews would take vows so seriously because you don't want to be correlate with the vow, to a secular culture in which the government suborns perjury to put criminals away. I just think that's a piece of the change where Protestants at least aware of surrounding culture. So even though they have the inner sense of certitude, it's not unquestioning. So then looked at when the newsreels came out of the killing camps.
Yeah. Right.
That was a piece of it.
Yeah. Okay, good. Moving on. Let's see. No, I forgot.
Thus we cannot extinguish the unquenchable fire of divine wrath of the prophets, of which the prophets speak, nor can we convert the Jews.
Go ahead.
With prayer and the fear of God, we must practice a sharp mercy to see whether we might save at least a few from the glowing flames.
Save at least a few, right? So
they're going to convert a few, yeah. Right,
exactly. The number of converts, the number of Jews whom we should expect to actually wholeheartedly become Christian is a very small number. And you can make the point that other than Spain, that was the reality, right? Throughout history, in the face of all kinds of pressure, massive conversion of Jews did not happen.
Well, the only reason that you got massive conversions in Spain and Portugal was they were going to be thrown out of their homes. And in other countries, Jews left.
Stop. Correction, Barbara.
Oh, really?
The massive conversion took place in 1391 after pogroms or during pogroms throughout Spain. It had nothing to do with an expulsion.
No?
That's when the whole problem of the conversos arose. The Jews who had converted and whom many in the country believed had basically done that to save their lives, but who really didn't accept Christianity.
Right.
Okay, but that was over a course of a century that percolated.
Oh, I thought it was all done. Okay.
Oh, no. Okay. But even that more recent scholarship said that whole notion of masses of Jews really not accepting their conversion, and the ones who lit Shabbos candles, in the basement, all those stories, and really tried to avoid treif meat if they could. I don't. That was a hard one, obviously. But the point is that more recent studies over the last 30 years of the documents that exist surrounding will show us that many of the people who converted, a larger percentage actually continue to live as Catholics, okay? And that many of the ones who maintained these traditions were really not seriously, this was sort of an emotional tie that they had. Okay, it was like today's Jews who on Sunday morning go get lox and bagel because they're Jewish. So Friday night they light candles because they're Jewish, but not really. And that in all kinds of different levels. Okay, so it's not that simple, right? But that was a process that developed over the course of 100 years till the expulsion in 1482. And even there, the numbers of those expelled, as opposed to the possible number of Jews in Spain, nobody knows for sure the exact number. And many numbers have been grossly exaggerated, okay? And that research is still taking place. AJ.
This is a request to please teach a class on the Iberian Peninsula Jewish history between 1000 and 1500.
Yeah, that would be a lot of fun, actually.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, that I'll think about that one, AJ. You can send me send me an email.
Writing it now.
In the middle of June.
All right.
All right, seriously, that would be great. Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay, good. See, you learn every day. Okay, so the going flames. Now, continue, Barbara. We
dare not avenge ourselves. Vengeance 1,000 times worse than we could wish them already has them by the throat. I shall give you my sincere advice.
Right, so vengeance is not the reason here. Again, he's speaking as the scholar, as the person who does not want to see an explosion of irrational activity, right? That's his conservative side with a small c, okay? He doesn't want that because then, in a sense, I can see him thinking, because then you're letting the devil come in and take over you, and they don't want to do that. So he says, this is not because of vengeance. This is to help save our souls.
Yeah, right.
All right, so I saw who had a hand up.
I was just saying that it doesn't matter. If your synagogue and your home is burned, who cares why?
You mean as the Jew?
Right.
Yeah, no,
right.
but talking
if he thought that distinction, was meaningful, it seems strange.
Yeah, no, but he's saying no vengeance, that the Christians should not take vengeance out on the Jews.
Right, just burn their synagogues and their houses.
Right, because it's reasonable. Okay, look, what's reasonable? All right. Remember, modern anti-Semitism came out of pseudoscience, not hard science, in terms of understanding the nature of societies. Okay? We'll talk about that when we get there. But it was bad science. And in the end, looking backwards, it was pseudoscience. Okay? So, I mean, in a sense, he's trying to prevent that kind of extreme things where reason gets thrown aside and you're motivated by blindness, right? He accuses the Jews of being blind. We saw that before. But he believes that Jesus taught values that are ultimately true, that are supposed to put limits on how people act, right? Jesus was not blind to ethics and morals. And in his mind, neither was he. But here he was dealing with an entity that he thought had to be removed. He didn't ask for, slaughtering, right? He doesn't talk about death camp, right? You'll see. Yeah, make life hard. Yes, because if you make life hard, what will it do? It will make them want to leave. It'll help us get rid of them, okay? On the other hand, yes, if you're starting to talk to people and call them sons of the devil, and that floating around, and he understood it in the context of the Christian Bible, all right, and I don't know that he thought through the notion that this means that genocide is a valid solution. I don't think he's calling for genocide, because if we're genocide, he'd simply say, just take your knives, forks, spoons, axes, whatever you got, and go out and start killing. He doesn't call for that. And now, as you can understand, the way he frames things and sets, a generation that would be willing to think in those terms could definitely pick up on that, given their interpretation of it, and say, Martin Luther said, da-da-da-da-da. Well, if they are of the devil, that means they are of the archenemy. And that means that if we can't get them out, kill them. Now you're with Hitler. And remember, by the way, that initially, what was Hitler's first desire with respect to the Jews? In Germany, what was it? Get them out.
Get them out, yeah. He wanted to...
When did he decide that genocide was the only solution?
Wannsee.
Right, but that was an organizing.
Yes.
Yeah, but he realized before that, though, when they started in 1939. What happened in 1939?
Invasion of Poland, as the German troops, as the Blitzkrieg moved eastward, they conquered lands that had a lot more Jews in them. By the time they got to the Pale, he started a war against the Jews, specifically to take out the Jews.
The only way, there's no way you could move all those people to Madagascar. And besides his own conscious image of what he represented, remember, he ultimately believed that he was, in a sense, the savior of the world. Because if he got the Jews, if he was able to get rid of all the Jews in the world, plus a few other minor groups, then the world would be cleansed of these horrible races, and the master race could then take over the world. And that is where it appears he was wanting to go. And so therefore the solution had to be very, very pragmatic. Kill them and find a way to totally get rid of them so they don't take up any space here. And that'll be the policy that we have. Because remember, the Jews in France was not a genocidal country prior to Hitler's conquest. And then suddenly Jews from France were being sent to the east to be killed. And there were Frenchmen, Christian Frenchmen, who said, fine. All right. So, I mean, that was a step-by-step evolution in Hitler's own thinking. Okay. You don't have that here, but you can see how people would draw out of it lessons that Luther probably never anticipated they would. All right. Now, here is the plan. Okay. Page 3, bottom paragraph. Now, this is going to be repetitious, I know. So let's just read it through quickly. Somebody read, please. Paul, can you read?
Sure. He's giving his advice, first to set fire to the synagogues or souls, and to bury and cover with dirt whatever will not burn, so that no man will ever again see a stone or cinder of them. This is to be done in honor of our Lord and of Christendom, so that God might see that we are Christians and do not condone or knowingly tolerate such public lying, cursing, and blaspheming of his Son and of his Christians. For whatever we tolerated in the past unknowingly, and I myself was unaware of it, will be pardoned by God. But if we, now that we are informed, will protect and shield such a house for the Jews, existing right before our very nose, in which they lie about, blaspheme, curse, vilify, and defame Christ and us, as was heard above, it would be the same as if we were doing all this, and even worse ourselves, as we very well know.
Now, remember I suggested this may be based on John Chrysostom of Antioch in the 380s CE, who wrote these 8 sermons on the synagogue of Satan. And that was a concept that he couldn't implement, but it was a concept that was revived. I mean, his writings were revived, rediscovered sometime in the 12th, 13th century. So this is percolating, and so you could see this as a kind of I have no doubt that Luther must have heard of him and had seen such of these things. That's the first thing that he mentioned, the synagogue.
Mm-hmm. In the context, is this advice to rulers in the German areas?
Yes.
To rulers and not to the mob.
Well, I mean, he's writing this is focused on them, but the book was published and intended for whomever wanted to read it.
Yeah.
Okay, so anybody could buy into these concepts. Yes, go ahead.
Second, I advise that their houses also be razed and destroyed, for they pursue in them the same aims as in their synagogues. Instead, they might be lodged under a roof or in a barn like the gypsies.
Okay, so their homes. So if you remember what we studied with little Saint John, right, in the 16th century, blood libel, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how that was spread around. And remember, in the letter that we read, and in the information that was being shared and publicized, and again, some of these things were being put into print. You have a description of how the Jews in their homes planned out this whole blood libel thing. Not the blood libel, but the killing of this child and what it was for and how it happened. So it came not only out of their synagogues, but it came out of the home. And those documents continued to percolate down during the 16th century. Okay, and you even had, remember, monuments put up in different places in commemoration of this little saint, this little 2-year-old boy. All right, so it's, again, you can see the association here of these different institutions that are they're also, of course, very central, but you can plug it into these different tendencies that were floating around Christianity at that point in time. Okay, continue. Third,
I advise that all their prayer books and Talmudic writings in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught be taken from them.
Right. And that, of course, is an old answer, right? That happens, we know, a number of times. It had happened before in different places in Europe. And as I said earlier, in the 16th century, this was written sometime around 1536. 20 years later, that's what's going to happen in Italy. More burning of the Talmud. Okay, this we can see, this is going on in a sense during that period, live and in living color. Okay, very good. Somebody else read. Fourth. Anybody? Come on.
I can do that.
Okay.
Fourth, I advise that their rabbis be forbidden to teach henceforth on pain of loss of life and limb, for they have justly forfeited the right to such an office by holding the poor Jews captive with the saying of Moses, Deuteronomy 17:10 and following, in which
notion, that's what we call the elastic clause of the Bible. It says, and when there is an issue in your age, when there are questions that come up that need to be answered, right? Not relying anymore on the oracles in the temple, then you listen to the sages that are in existence at that time. I mean, subsequent generation. Okay, and of course the rabbis use that as a means of justifying their authority based on Torah. So he brilliantly is picking up on this, and basically this is the whole point, that the rabbis overstepped their bounds and took over, right? And this flows out of elements of the medieval attack on Judaism by converts who were kicked out of the communities by the rabbis for their heretical leaning. Okay? And so they would point out to the popes, the Jews don't really believe in the Bible anymore, they believe in the Talmud. All right? And that happened. Now, there were popes who reversed that and who said, no, they have the Talmud, but they believe in that it is their interpretation of the Bible. Then, of course, came what Luther's saying is, well, but these rabbis don't even really understand the Bible. Anyhow, but this is a developing notion of the power of the clergy, right? The Jewish clergy to influence their people. So therefore, you got to stop them from teaching, okay? So Deuteronomy, yes, that's the basis.
Okay,
who was reading?
I was reading. Let me just go back. For they, the rabbis, have justly forfeited the right to such an office by holding the poor Jews captive with the saying of Moses, in which he commands them to obey their teachers on penalty of death, although Moses clearly adds, what they teach you in accord with the law of the Lord. These villains ignore that. They wantonly employ the poor people's obedience contrary to the law of the Lord, and infuse them with this poison, cursing, and blasphemy. In the same way, the Pope also held us captive with the declaration in Matthew 16:18, you are Peter, etc., inducing us to believe all the lies and deception that issued from his devilish mind. He did not teach in accord with the word of God, and therefore he forfeited the right to teach.
Continue.
So he's put the Pope in the same category as rabbis.
Yes. Continue. Go ahead. Fifth.
Okay, well, he saw the Pope had a kippah. First, he saw the Pope had a kippah, perhaps. That was confusion. Fifth, I advise that safe conduct on the highways be abolished completely for Jews. They have no business in the countryside, since they are not lords, officials, tradesmen, or the like. Let them stay at home.
Right. Okay.
Sixth,
they shouldn't be, merchant.
Right. Sixth, I advise that usury be prohibited to them, and that all cash and treasure of silver and gold be taken from them and put aside for safekeeping. The reason for such a measure is that, as said above, they have no other means of earning a livelihood than usury, and by it they have stolen and robbed from us all they possess. Such money should now be used in no other way than the following. Whenever a Jew is sincerely converted, he should be handed 100, 200, or 300 florins, as personal circumstances suggest. With this, he could set himself up in some occupation for the support of his poor wife and children and the maintenance of the old and feeble. For such evil gains are cursed if they are not put to use with God's blessing in a good and worthy cause. What Christian love and...
Yes, it's wonderful.
Be interesting to know how much that would be worth in this day and age, the number of florins they wanted to give out.
Yes. I can't do that. I'm sorry. All right, somebody else. Seventh.
I commend putting a flail, an axe, a hoe, a spade, a distaff, or a spindle.
Wait, hold on 1 second. Wait, remember, so they cannot do usury.
Right.
They should be able to earn a living. And therefore, what shall they do? Now, this, by the way, in a certain sense, is a policy that, that Russia developed for the Jews they set up, what was it called? A whole region near on the east.
Oh, the Pale of Settlement.
Huh?
You're talking about the Pale of Settlement?
No.
No, to the east, where Chagall actually
They could be
was.
farmers, and do these things.
Yeah.
Which failed, of course, because what does a shtetl Jew know from farming, But it's a nice idea, that they become good.
There was no infrastructure to support it anyway if they had been farmers.
Yeah, that's true. But, as we learned even in the United States, there were areas here where Jews who came out of the shtetls were resettled, hoping to create farms. And they ended up moving into towns where they became merchants because it was just something that was so foreign. And they felt there was an immediate, as you say, AJ, there was no way to keep them going while they were learning how to do these things. You don't learn to be a farmer overnight, right? It takes a lot of experience to be able to run, farms that really work. So it takes time. But in the meantime, how do they feed themselves? Oh, I don't know. All right, anyway. But it was a nice thought. Continue, yes.
So now more kindness to the Jews.
7. I commend putting, go ahead.
I commend putting a flail, an axe, a hoe, a spade, a distaff, or a spindle in the hands of young, strong Jews and Jewesses, and letting them earn their bread in the sweat of their brow, as was imposed on the children of Adam in Genesis. For it is not fitting that they should let us accursed goyim toil in the sweat of our faces, while they, I'm going to do air quotes, the holy people, idle away their time behind the stove, feasting and farting, and on top of all,
yes,
boasting blasphemously of their lordship over the Christians by means of our sweat. No, one should toss out these lazy rogues by the seat of their pants.
Okay. So
I note there are 7, which is that magical number, one for each day of the week.
Yeah, but there was, I thought
That's
that was
Torah.
7. All right. Well, there is another. Hold on.
Oh, there an 8th? Because normally in Torah, 7 means it has a special.
1 second.
Well, this had nothing to do with Torah.
No, I'm saying that.
I know you're being facetious.
I am being. They're adopting the set. Anyhow.
No, somebody else read that last paragraph on page 5. It continues on page 6.
Okay, but what will happen even if we do burn down the Jews' synagogues and forbid them publicly to praise God, to pray, to teach, to utter God's name? They will still keep doing it in secret. If we know they are doing this in secret, it is the same as if they are doing it publicly. For our knowledge of their secret doings and our toleration of them implies that they are not secret after all, and thus our conscience is encumbered with it before God. Accordingly, it must and dare not be considered a trifling matter, but a serious one to seek counsel against this and to save our souls from the Jews, that is, from the devil and from eternal death. My advice, as I said earlier, is first that the synagogues be burned down, and that all who are able toss in sulfur and pitch. It would be good if someone could also throw in some hellfire. What the heck is that? That would demonstrate to God our serious resolve and be evidence to all the world that it was in ignorance that we tolerated such houses in which the Jews have reviled God, our dear Creator and Father, and His Son most shamefully up till now. But that we have now given them their due reward.
Right. But then in the next paragraph, he eventually says, go like halfway, no, 2/3 of the way down the next paragraph. So if in all of this is going on, they're still doing bad things, there it would be wrong to be merciful and confirm them in their conduct. If this does not help, we must drive them out like mad dogs so that we do not become partakers of their abominable blasphemy and all their other vices, and thus merit God's wrath and be damned with them. I have done my duty. Now let everyone see to his. I am exonerated. Okay. And
That's probably all he really wanted was to be exonerated. He wanted to go to heaven. He didn't want to go to hell.
Right. That's part of it. Right. But the 8th item, that's why I wanted to get back to this, is if all else fails, drive them out. And now you can see how that would feed right into Hitler's first solution. Drive them out. Now, I'm not saying he reached that because of Martin Luther, but I'm saying that allowed these Lutheran nationalists to resonate with Hitler. And if you're doing, and this is now percolating in the early 1930s, and this is something that continued to develop over time. Tybal, I want to put you on hold because I want us to take out this page. It's the next page, and I know I sent it with everything else.
Yeah, you did.
Huh?
You did. I have to leave, but we got a family genealogy
go ahead.
thing.
Anyway, these printed items were published in the 1930s. So what do you see on top? That is a published version of what?
Luther.
The Jews and Their Lies. What we are reading are published and circulated, okay? The second thing that you see are cards that you can send, postcards, and on it is a picture of Martin Luther. And next, below it is in German, it says the following: I do not seek for myself, but rather for the fortune and salvation for all of Germany. Now, the person who kept saying this over and over again, and I don't think anybody has found this in Luther, but this is a motto of Hitler. So here you have Martin Luther with a statement that is associated with Hitler. And this is all taking place in the 1930s. And this is why, as this decade continues to develop, the Lutheran nationalists became more and more in bed with the Nazis. And that rode through till 1945. And that's evidence, plus other things, of to me, that whole voting situation as well, of the fact that Luther became associated with Hitler. Even though that wasn't Luther's intention, okay? But that's what happened. So now we see how secular ideology and religious ideology at a certain point can come together. And that can happen anywhere. Okay, folks, next week we shall open up the Holy Quran and read some examples of what Muhammad taught and also what some of the scholars afterwards taught with respect to the Jews. Okay, and we will revisit Islam during probably our last meeting, when we will read selections from the Hamas Charter, which I know will just give you the biggest appetite when you finish.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.